Okay, Tov. So our goal for today is to try to finish up on the sugya of the Seder, the sequence of the 15 arayos as mentioned in the Mishnah. And here on the top of Daf Gimel Amid Aleph, the Gemara is a little bit confused about the fact that we wanted to apply the rule of Asya Midrasha Chavivale, meaning that whatever halacha and whatever status of an erva, as far as Yibum is concerned, is derived from a drasha, that has a special chavivus. As we said yesterday, it connects the Torah Shabbat with the Torah Shabbat Peh, and therefore comes first. So the Gemara asks on the top of Daf Gimel, but Kulu Nami Midrasha also. In effect, all of the arayos with regard to the P'tur of Tzara are derived from the division, analogy to Eshes, to Achos Isha, so that everything is derived from a drasha. Therefore, you're not going to have a justification of the sequence in the Mishnah based on Isi Midrasha, because everything, the entire halacha from beginning to end of P'tur Tzara in all the arayos is derived from a drasha. The Marsha, as we began yesterday, at the end of yesterday's discussion, is not so happy with the Gemara's kasha, because the Gemara's answer was that we did not begin our Mishnah with Achos Isha. And the question is, why not? It seems like Achos Isha would be the most logical candidate for being the first erva to be mentioned on the list, because Achos Isha is not derived from a drasha, it's derived from a pasuk. The pasuk says litra in the parsha of Achos Isha. So the Gemara was bothered why the Mishnah didn't begin, the kickoff, the opening presentation, the grand opening of the Mishnah should have been Achos Isha, because that's the source from which we derive all these halachas that there's no yibum in the case of an erva. So now you want to tell me that the P'tur of Tzara in all the cases of yibum are derived from Achos Isha, and that's called Midrasha, but still, why doesn't Achos Isha appear first on the list? And the fundamental halacha, number one, that an erva doesn't fall for yibum if she's got an additional erva besides Achos Eshes Achiv, is derived from Achos Isha, where it's explicit. Now you want to darshan, well, what about the status of Itzara? That's also in the parsha of Achos Isha. It says Litzrar, and that excludes the Tzara in the case of Achos Isha, and then we equate all the other arayos. Yeah, but you still haven't answered why Achos Isha doesn't get prominence here, and it should be first on the list. And because the Marsha is so bothered by this question, he reinterprets the Gemara. And the Gemara here is asking the following question. As far as the P'tur Yavam is concerned, all the arayos are equal. What the Gemara is bothered by is the fact that Chamoso is not given precedence. Yesh lahachtim Chamoso l'shar arayos. That's the lashon of the Marsha. In other words, that not only have you still left one question unanswered, unaddressed, namely why Achos Isha isn't first, since that all the laws of erva and saras erva with regard to yibum are derived from Achos Isha. But the Gemara is going beyond that. The Gemara is asking, I don't understand why Chamoso is not given precedence. And the reason for the Gemara's kasha, according to the Marsha, is because only in the case of Chamoso does the Torah spell out Sreifa. And if we want to derive Sreifa in other cases, like for example in Bito, we're going to have to derive it from Chamosa. And yet paradoxically, Bito appears first on the list before Chamosa. So if you're operating with your logic of, you know what, let's give a special mila to that which is derived from a drasha, that's not going to satisfy me, because you want to go back to the source from which we derive the drasha, and I'll tell you why. Because I can attach that mila, that plus, that special yichus, that status of drasha to all 15 arayos. Because the Mishnah is establishing the din of tzaras erva, and that halach of tzaras erva in all arayos is derived from a drasha. Ela what? There's the malame, the main source, the primary source, which is achos, achos ishto. Well, that doesn't appear first on the list. And not only that, if you've already granted out this special mila of drasha to every single one of the 15 arayos, then for sure chamoso should get precedence over bito, because chamoso is the malamed, and the chiv sreifa in the case of bito is derived from chamoso. Therefore, bito should come second. So your premise, your regulation that the literary style of the Mishnah is that which is derived from a drasha gets precedence, well, I can't buy into that, because once I see that there's a mile of drasha with regard to all the arayos, then the sequence should be malamed and nilmad. Number one, in terms of the din of erva and tzaras erva, what is the malamed from which we derive it? And the answer is achos isha. That should be first on the list. And if you're talking about chumras ha'onshim, then chamoso should be first on the list. We're going according to Reb Shimon that sreifa is chamura miskila. And the case of sreifa and arayos, which is explicit in the Torah to teach me other cases, is chamoso. Bito is a derivative of chamoso, therefore chamoso should come first. Now here we have a quote from a sefer called the Madura Basra. Apparently it's a Kadmon. It's someone that dates back almost to the time of the Rishonim. And if anybody could tell me who authored that sefer, I tried to look it up in my favorite treasure book is the Basic Tzmarim, and he doesn't have it there, unless I misspelled it. I don't know. And he says the following. The Gemara had asked the Kasha originally, listening chamoso bereisha. And the Gemara was bothered why chamoso doesn't appear first on the list, given the regulation that the rule that serves, primary rule that serves us here in the Seder Mishnah is chumras avera, then chamoso should come first, because in the case of chamoso, the Torah says that the onish is sreifa. And that was the Gemara's kasha back on Daf Beis Amid Beis, Lisnei Chamoso Bereisha. Correct? Let's see it inside. It's approximately 4 lines up before the end of Daf Beis Amid Beis. Lisnei Chamoso Bereisha. Now, that kasha of the Gemara was predicated on the principle called chumrei tfei nakat, that we will put the greater chumrah first on the list. Gemara now substitutes a different rule and regulation that governs which should come first on the list, and that is midrasha chavivale. So the Gemara obviously has now rescinded its original position. L'chatchila in the Shakla V'Tari, the Gemara thought that the overriding principle here is chumrah. Now the Gemara rejects it because then chamosa should be first. And now the Gemara substitutes a different rule, namely drasha. And the Maharsha is learning that the Gemara's kasha here on the top of Daf Gimel of Kulu Nami V'Drasha Asli is resurrecting the original position of chumrah, and therefore the Gemara is bothered why chamoso didn't come first on the list. The Maradura Basra can't tolerate that interpretation because the Gemara has already thrown overboard that the application of that principle of chumrah adif v'nakit tfei. So therefore, once we have thrown out that principle and its application here to our mission of chumrah tfei, then the question of why chamoso doesn't come before bito is no longer a question. The underlying premise of that catch in the Gemara, the objection that chamoso should come before bito, is based on chumrah. We threw out chumrah. We've already rejected chumrah. So why would we go back to that? And now the Gemara is saying, well, chamosa should come before bita. Doesn't make any sense. He says, Shuv ein lahakshos, lama hikdima mishnah bito lechamosa. The lama lo kosos bito liachar chamosa. I mean, none of those questions about the Chumash Haveris and everything should be applicable. We've already put that premise on the back burners. It's been shelved, been replaced. Al Kain Pirish on the top of Yud Aleph. This is the Madura Basra. She'ein kushas haGemara kan ella al loshen hamatarit she'omar bito. The Gemara had established the principle of drasha chavivale, and you'll see this on Daf Beis Amid Beis. Ella Bito, the last line, as to why Bito is first on the list is because of drasha. Now the Gemara has an objection. How could you tell me that Bito comes first? And you're applying the principle of Asya Midracha. And you're saying that what? That Bito is Asya Midracha, but not the other Arayas. So the Gemara says that's not so. The entire entity of P'tur Arayas is derived from Midracha, from Achos Ishta. So you're going to give first dibs and primary, glory to Bito? What do you mean? Is it true that as far as Sreif is concerned, we derive Bito in a drasha from a Gzeir Shabbat to Chamos? So Bito definitely has a Maila, but that doesn't give it special yichus vis-a-vis all the other arayos listed in the Mishnah. Because what's common to all the other arayos, as far as the tour of Erva from Yibum and Saras Erva, is they're all derived from a drasha. And basically, according to this interpretation of the Gemara, we're left with no answer whatsoever. We've thrown out the answer of Chamira because if that be the case, Chamosa should come before Bito. We then tried another avenue and we suggested that Drasha Chaviva. We've thrown that out now because all the Arayas are Drasha Chaviva. You don't have any rational, logical approach to justify the sequence in the Mishnah. And now the Gemara comes up with a beautiful answer here on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph in the light of the interpretation of the Gemara's question of the Madura Basra. The Gemara says the following: Nehi dili inyan yibu asya midrasha, all the halachas of yibu with regard to arayos are derived from an equation to Achos Ishta, where it says Litzror. But Iker Isure Behedrik Sivbe. If you want to know whether the Erva itself, as a status, as a category of Arayos, is derived from a drasha, or it's explicit in the Torah, I have a chiddush for you. That Bito is derived from a drasha. Now, what is the Gemara hakin here? What does this mean? Bito is explicit in the Torah, although it doesn't say Bito, but it says Bas Ishto. And Bito is Bas Ishto. Is she not? Well, maybe she's not. In what case? Bas Hanusos. So the Gemara now is going to focus our attention It's like it reminds me of if you ever used binoculars or a telescope. You have to focus. You have to hone in on something. The Gemara now is going to hone in on Bito from the perspective of Bito Anusaso. And the entire entity as an erva of Bito Anusaso is derived from a drush. Is Iker Isuraye Beheja Ksivu Bibito. He says the following, that the Iker Isur in all other arais is Behedrik Ksivu. Just go through the parashiyos and Achrimos, and in Kedoshim you'll exhaust the whole list of arais. But the Bito, again we're talking about Bito Manusaso, Ikar Isura Midrasha, the category of Bito as an erva in the case of Anusaso is derived from a drasha. In other words, according to the Madura Basra, the Gemara is now shifting its focus on the concept of Midrasha Ka'asya. We thought that the subject of Midrasha Asya is the law of Yibum. And what governs our Mishnah within the context of Midrasha are the laws that apply to an erva vis-a-vis the mitzvah of Yibum and Tzaras erva as well. So Gemara argues very well, top line, Kula Nami Midrasha. But now the Gemara says, wait a minute, I'm going back to fundamentals. I'm going back to first grade. I want to know where the Ikar Isura is derived from. We're going to now organize Bito as a special Mila, and she gets first primary, frontal stage here in that Mishnah because the erva of Bito itself as an Isur erva is derived from it. So we've shifted our whole perspective. It's a whole change. We thought that let's look in the laws of Yevamot, and in Hilchos Yibum we have a whole chapter of what's the status of an erva with regard to Yibum, and the truth is they're all derived from a drasha. Every last one of the arais is derived from the paradigmic case of Achos Ishto. Now the Gemara says, no, take a shift, a paradigm shift. You know what drasha Chavivile is referring to? Is the Ikar Isur erva. Forget about Yibum. Let's say I would create a Masechta called Masechta Arayos. Bito would be first on the list. Because Bito Anusasa, as we'll see in Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdimi, is derived from a drasha. Now again, the Marsha is going to have problems over here because Marsha says that the Gemara is going back to its original premise that Chamoso should come before Bito because the Chiyuv Sreifa of Bito is derived from Chamoso. So according to Marsha, if we're reverting back to the original premise that it's Chumras HaVeira that gives first primary status, then Chamoso certainly should come before Bito. Marsha, Ich mitu retzes. We should have had Kaloso up there, and it should have been either before Chamoso, if you apply the principle of drasha, or it should be after Chamoso. Keep in mind, Rabosai, that Kaloso is last on the list. Number 15. We try harder, right? And Kalaso is a Chiyuv Skila. We go now down from a Chiyuv Sreifa to the next level, which is a Chiyuv Skila. None of the other Arayos, other than Chamoso, Bito, and Kalaso, generate a Chiyuv Nisa. They're not capital crimes. They're Chiyuv Kares. So the Maharsha says that since the Gemara is making that valiant effort to say that you cannot operate with the principle of Drocha Chavivale because all the arayos are derived from a drasha, therefore you have to go back according to the Maharsha's understanding, revert back to the original premise that we're dealing with Chumrah, then I don't get it. Why is Kalasa, which is a Chiv Misa, delegated to last on the list? Says the Maharsha, Chen gam l'tirit zeh. Tzarich lahosef is that tirit hagmor maskenoso. Shemeyach shepasach b'krovei atzmo ismich la achoso. V'akachim shebechol isuri achva. V'sof shana es kalos. In other words, the Maharsha is saying that at this point in the sugya, we do not understand why kaloso is last on the list. We'll only understand that when we get to the middle of this Amud, and the Gemara presents the final answer as to why the Tana, why Rav Yutanasi organized the Mishnah in that sequence. Now, he suggests another approach of the Chosen Yeshuos. I wrote down his name, but I don't have it right in front of me, but that you can look up very easily in the Beis Hakitz form. Anyway, the Chosen Yeshuos is more of a contemporary. He writes that B'tiritz HaGemara, Bito Ikar Isura Midrasha, we now have an answer to Kaloso as well. Why? Shelo Rotzasah Mishnah Listom Bidvareha Lo Kidivei Reb Shimon the Lo Kidivei Chacham. The Chosein Yeshuos introduces another paradigm shift here. There's a machlokus between the Chacham and Reb Shimon, which is more chomer, skila or sreifa. Whereas, according to Reb Shimon, sreifa is more chomer than skila. The Chacham have skila more chomer than what? Than sreifa. We don't want to get into that machlokus. The Tana of Mishnah is deliberately trying to avoid this machlokus. Lo Reb Shimon, v'lo Chacham. If Kalasa would have been up front, meaning right after Chamosa, then clearly the Mishnah would be reflecting that Shita of Rabbi Shimon. If, on the other hand, Kalasa would be first on the list before Chamoso, that would be telling me that Skila is more Chamura than Sreifa, like the Chachamim Shita. So in order to avoid this machlokas, Kosvas Kalosim Sofa Mishnah, the Acher Chai Ve'akaris. Unbelievable. Could you imagine? The Mishnah does acrobatics to avoid the possibility that we might think that it is reflecting either the Shita of Shimon or that of Chacham. I'm going to show you that the Mishnah is neutral on this machlokas because I'm going to put Kaloso at the end. Very muddy, if you ask me, because Kaloso is a chiv skila. Chamoso and Bito are sreifa. They come first on the list, whereas Kaloso is last on the list. I mean, if the Mishnah was trying to impress me that we're not dealing with any particular shita, and we're not biased in favor of Shimon, I don't think the Mishnah did a very good, convincing job of that. Because when I read the Mishnah, I see Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah. And those arayos that are listed first are Chiyuvei Sreifa, and Kalaso is at the end of the list. The Chosen Yeshua says, birds on, you're off your rock. The Mishnah went out of its way to place an entire list of arayos in the middle, separating between Chamoso at the beginning and Kalaso at the end. That can't work out logically going to any sheep of the Tanoim. If our Mishnah was pushing the agenda in favor of Trump, in favor of Kalaso, that means in favor of the Chachamim Shita, that the chiyuv skila should be more chomer, then kalasa should be first. And if the Mishnah is in favor of the other guy, meaning in favor of Rabbi Shimon, then why isn't kalasa listed secondly? The Mishnah shouldn't have pushed in all the different arayas before kalasa. Your major consideration here is chumas havera, and you start with the chiyuv misa. According to Rabbi Shimon, start with chamoso and bito, and then go on to kalasa. Kalasa is a chiyuv misa, but all the other arayas are only a chiyuv kares. How can kalasa be listed at the end? So by removing kalasa from the sequence here, the Mishnah is telling you that we're not operating with chumrah at all. Chumrah is not the criteria. Okay. And now on both sides, we want to know, how do we derive bita? So for this, we need a chumash. Oh, again, I had to bring in more chumashim. We're going to open up to those two psukim that we discussed yesterday. Let's see it again. Always good to see it again. Osios Machakimos. And we are in Parsha Achrimos, and we are now in Perek Yudches. And we had those two psukim, Yud and Yud Zayin, if I remember correctly. Let's see, Perek Yudches. And it says in Pasuk Yud, Ervas bas bincha o bas bitcha lo segala ervasan ki ervascha hena. Now this pasuk is addressing the relatives of the father in this case. I call him the father because we're dealing with the erva of bas, and we could call him the grandfather as well. No mention whatsoever of an erva that's related to him through his wife. That appears only, if you fast forward, in Pasuk Yud Zayin. Ervas Isha, and now we go through the arayas that are engendered by your wife's relatives. Bita, Baspina, Baspita. Lo Sigaleh. Where am I? Lo Sikach Legalos Ervasa. She'ero Sha'ara Hena Zima He. A lot of words here in this passage. But we do have the word Hena, that's important. And then we'll get back to the word Zima a little bit later. These are the relatives of Bas through your wife. Amar Rav Amar Li, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdime, Asya Hena Hena. In both psukim, we have Hena. And that's going to give us a Gzereshava of Hena Hena. What does that mean? In Pasuk Yud Zayin, the later Pasuk, Sha'ara Hena Zima Hi, where we have Bas Ishto, Bas Beno, Bas Bita. These are the arayas through your wife. But now, when we go back to Pasuk Yud, the earlier Pasuk, we're going to have to say that somehow we're putting Bas into the Parsha, but now it's not going to be the Bas because it's the daughter of your wife, but it's your daughter. The Darshim, and what does this Gzeira Shava teach me? Kishem shebe'iser krovas ishto din bita ukedin baspina ubaspita. It's explicit in this pasuk with regard to ishto, pasuk Yud Zayin, that bita has the same status, even a greater erva, than Baspino and Baspito. So when we go back to the Isser of his relatives, his Bas, then we're going to have to put in Bas because the Torah says explicitly Baspino, Baspito. So let's go back to Pasuk Yud, Ervas Bas Bincha or Bas Bitcha. Where's Bas? So the Hena is going to give me the word bas. And that's going to tell me that even if it's his bas and it's not his wife's bas, namely it's on Soso, then it's Bito and she's included in this Erev. And now we have an answer to the Gemara's question. What is the sequence here? Bito, first on the list, and we're saying Ikar Isuro is Midrasha Ka'asi. We derive the Isur Bas, in the case of Bas Anusoso, from the Gzeira Shalom. That's what gives Bito a special status. Now Rav Yitzchak Bar Avdimi wants to finish up, and he's saying, okay, from this drasha in Parshas Achremos, you derive Bito Anusoso as an Azhara, as an Isur Erev. But it's only in Parshas Kedoshim that the Torah spells out the Onshim. How do we know that Bito Anusoso has the same Onesh as Bas Ishto? So he says, Asya Zima Zima. So for this, we have to fast forward to Parshas Kedoshim. In this case, Perek Chav Pasuk Yudalid, without losing our place here at the end of Achremos. And the Torah says the following: the ish asher yikach es isha ves ima zima hi ba'eich yisufru osa. So we're talking now about a mother-in-law, a moso, right? Isha ves ima, and the Torah says zima hi. So we have now a secret password, zima. We turn back to Parshas Achremos, Perek Yud Ches, Pasuk Yud Zayin, and there also it says zima hi. So now we have one Gzeira Shava that leads us to a second Gzeira Shava. The first Gzeira Shava is going to teach us that Bito is Bisreifa. And how do I know that the Onish of Bito is Bisreifa? That I derive from Chamoso, because both in the Parsha of Bito, in the Azhara at the end of Achremos, and in the Parsha of the Onish in Kedoshim, in both Parshios, I don't know, Mitch, I put you on mute, but it didn't work. Just joking. But in both Parshas, it used the word Zima. So that Gzeira Shava going to teach me that Bito Mi Ishto generates a Chiyuv Sreifa like Chamoso. So Chamoso is a relationship through his wife, right? This is the mother of his wife. And Bito is a relationship through his wife. This is the daughter of his wife. So the mother of his wife and the daughter of the wife have an equation of Zima. And from that Gzeira Shava, we're going to derive that Bito Mi Ishto generates a Chiyuv Sreifa. Now we're going to pile it up. Now that's going to drag us back to the original Gzeira Shava of Hena, which teaches me that just like Bito Mi Ishto is equivalent to all the generations that come beyond, so do Bito Mimenu, his Krova, that's not related to his wife, Anusaso, is also equivalent to all the other generations and the Arias that come through his Bas, all the grandchildren. Granddaughters, I should say, in case of women. Now, I'm not sure if the Gemara, since the purpose and the goal of this Gemara is to justify the sequence of the Mishnah in the 15 Arais, I'm not sure if the Gemara needed to add this discussion about Sreifa of the second Gzeira Shava quoted here by Rav Yitzchak Bar Avdimi, Zima. But that might depend upon how to interpret the Gemara, right? If you assume like the Maharsha that the Gemara still has Chumras Havera as one of the important elements in the equation to determine the Seder HaMishnah, then we want to know for sure that Bito has a Chiyuv Sreifa. And since Bito in our Mishnah, as we saw in Rashi, is referring to Bito Me'anusaso is there a Chiyuv Sreifa, which would justify why Bito is first on the list. If, on the other hand, the Gemara has benched, has put aside the Svara of Chumras HaBeira, and the Gemara is really focusing on Drasha, then L'chora I would say that all we need is Heina Heina. And that's going to prove that the Ikar Erva of Bito Man Saso is derived from Gzeira Shava, and therefore Bito is first on the list. Says the Gemara, okay, one second. Now, we have the following. The Aruch LaNer is bothered because, as we said before, Ishto is included. Bito mi Ishto is called Bas Ishto. Bas Anusaso is not Bas Ishto, and therefore is not included, at least not explicitly, in Torah Sav in Pasuk Yud Zayin of Ervas Ishto. Now, the Aruch LaNer is bothered, and it's really a kasha that predates the Aruch LaNer by many, many centuries. It's in the Rashba already. But the Aruch LaNer is going to try to answer the Rashba's kasha. And he says the following, that according to Rashi here in this sugya, the word Isha in Pasuk Yud Zayin in Perek Yud Ches, meaning Eras Isha, right? Eras Isha is a reference to Ishus, to wedlock, as we say in English. It was Kiddushin, and therefore the Torah says Ervas Isha. In Pasuk Yud, the Torah omits the word Isha, and all it says is Bas Bito, Bas Bito, etc. Meaning the Torah deliberately omitted the word Isha to emphasize that we're not talking about Ishus. There was no wedlock here, and the Bito emerges outside of an Ishus relationship. So again, the reason why the Torah omits the word Isha in Pasuk Yud, where it includes the word Isha in Pasuk Yud Zayin, is clearly to indicate that the Bito of Pasuk Yud is not the same Bito as Pasuk Yud Zayin. The Bito of Pasuk Yud was out of wedlock. Bito me'anusasa. So the Rashba doesn't understand. Asks the Rashba, it says, Ervas Ishtecha ubita lo sigala. Where is that pasuk? Mitch, can you help me out here? Where is this pasuk? You have the chumash here? It should be over here. Just forget about these pages here. Okay, it says Ervas Isho Bita. Okay, where's that? That's Pasuk Yud Zayin? Oh, so the Rashba wants to know the following. If the Torah wants to use the word Isha to indicate Ishus, then it should have said Ervas Ishtecha. It doesn't say Ervas Ishtecha. It says Ervas Isha Ubita. And he says the following. I disagree with Rashi, says the Rashba. The word Isha does not indicate Ishus. The word Ishtecha indicates your wife, meaning that you were Makadisha with Kiddush. But Ishas down, ain b'mashma also loshan Ishus. How did Rashi build mountains and towers on this premise that if in Pasuk Yud Zayin it says Isha, it must be referring to Ishus. Says the Rashba, the exact word in the Torah for Ishus is Ishtecha. Then the Rashba quotes the Gemara later on in Daf Sadi Zayin that the Gemara has a drasha from the words She'era Hema. And that tells you that you're talking about Isho Vita. Okay, so actually, my purpose today is to get to the Aruch LaNer. The Aruch LaNer presents what I think is a logical explanation of our Gemara based on Rashi. And he says the following, that you have to add a little piece to Rashi. And that the raya of the Gemara to prove that in the Pasuk, in Yud Zayin, Pasuk Yud Zayin, there's no Bas Anusasa, is because the Torah does not say Ervas Aim Ubita Lo Segal. What does that mean? He says, Ikar Shoresh Isha B'chol Makom Migzar Miloshen Ishus. The Eino Nofel Ela Al Nesua. Aval Pnuya Ru'uya Lihikare Nekeva Below Isha. Umashem Ishtavish Bo Hakosu Gam B'Pnuya Hi Al Derech Hashola Kedei Lechos B'Loshen Nekiya. Aval Heichan She'efshel Linkot B'Loshen Nekiya U'Lechanosa Bas Ein Roy Likrosa Isha. So the thrust here is that if you're talking about a woman and her daughter, like we had before, based on Parshas Kedoshim, a woman and her mother, a woman and her daughter, it should have said Aim Ubita. Instead, the Torah uses the word Isha Ubita. What's the difference between Aim Ubita and Isha Ubita? He says that the word Isha Ubita, as opposed to Aim Ubita, indicates that she is your wife. And that's a lashon of Ishus. And in fact, he says that if you were talking about an Anusa situation where she's not necessarily married, then the word should have been Nekeva and not Isha. Again, sometimes he admits the Torah used the word Isha to refer to a Pnuya, a non-married woman, but that's only because it's avoiding the word Nekeva. Nekeva has a little bit of a, not totally a sensitive, Lashon Nekeva. It's not so Sanua. But he says that the Torah should have said Emu Bita, and instead it says Ishtecha Ubita, right? What's the language of the pasuk here again? Isha Ubita. He says that the word Isha therefore means Isha. Okay. Now, Rabosai, let's see how the Gemara on Daf Gimel comes to a final conclusion. Hashta the Amrit. Let's say, make sure we're all on the same page. We're 5 lines down from the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hashta the Amrit. Now you gave us the answer that what? That called Milsa the Asa Midrasha Chavivale. And the Iker Isser Bito is derived from the Gzeir Shava because we're talking about Bito Mianu Saso. So we understand why Bito is first on the list. Then, what should be last on the list? Last on the list should be something that's explicit in the Torah. Why? Because that's the exact opposite of Midrash Chavival, is listening lachos isha lebasof. Why? Because the tour of erba in the case of Yibum is derived from achos isha, from the word aleha, as we spoke about, from the word litzrar. In the case of all the other arayos, we derive from an equation that just like achos isha teaches me that there's no yibum in the case of erva, and there's no yibum in the tzaras erva, so too it's true for all the arayos. If that be the case, then all the arayos have a certain chavivus that achos ishta does not have. So you started with bito because the ikar isur is derived from a gzera shava, from a drush, is chavivus. Fine. But now let's apply the principle of chavivale in the yibum context, not in terms of the ikar isur, but in terms of the pure yibum, which is after all the subject of our Mishnah. And in that context, achos isha is last on the list because it's the only erva that's not derived from a drasha, but rather from the parsha itself, where it says aleha and litzar. So if your criterion is drasha, and that's why Bito got first, then all the rest of the arayos are also let's say big shots, and they have this badge that says we are derived from a drasha, with the exception of achos isha. In a case of achos isha, the ikar isur is explicit in the pasuk, the ikar erva, and not only that, the din that there's no yibum is explicit in the parsha of achos isha. Masha enkein, all the other cases of arayos with regard to the ptur yibum, they are derived from achos isha. So we really are stuck now as to why achos isha. By the way, let's just see the Mishnah again. Where is achos isha in the list? We have the following. We have a whole list of bitos, his bas and his wife's bas. We have a whole list of chamaso. We have achos isha. So that now the question is, wait a second. After achos isha, you have eshes achiv me'imo. Then you have eshes achiv shelo hayabolam, and then you have kalas. All these are derived from a drush. In the case of kalasa, we're going to derive the chiv misa from a drush. But certainly, vis-a-vis yibum, all these are derived from drushes. And now it would make sense to plug in on the very end of this list, achos isha. Achos isha is the source in the Torah for all the others that are derived from a drush. If your criterion is drasha, then achos isha belongs at the end of the list. So the Gemara says, "Aidi di iri bi israch vasa tani achos ishto." We have, in the case of chamoso, we have I'm sorry. We start with bito, then we go to chamoso. Then we go to achosa. We have achoso imo, we have achos imo, achos ishto comes last here. Again, achos ishto should be the last of the 15. And make believe that's where it is in the Mishnah. We pulled it out of the last only because I did the iri be'achoso be'achveso. We were talking about his aunt either because she's achoso. One second. We're talking about achoso imo. Achos imo means his aunt, right? So why does achos imo appear here on the list? Because once he mentioned achoso mi imo, he mentions achos imo. Now he's ready for achos ishto. To take achos ishto out because it's explicit in the Torah would not make us very comfortable, because we've already picked up his own sister. Now we should pick up his wife's sister. So I know, I thought the Gemara would stop here. Finally get, make a siyum on this. The Gemara is still not happy. Listia lahai bava libasof. Right? What do we have here? We have this whole group of what the Gemara calls achvisa. And as a result of the group of the achvisa, we're going to have to put achos ishto into that group when really she belongs to be at the end. Now, after the achvisa group, we've got kalasa, correct? Oh, so kalasa should come before the achvisa group in order to guarantee that achos ishto is last on the list. Ella, and this is the final answer. This is where we, the hatchet rests. Ella Tanya, what is the criterion for the Seder of our Mishnah? Kurve Mekat. The Seder Arayas of the Mishnah is based on how close they are in their relationship to the Yavam. I mean, to Ruvain, who has to be Miyabim, the wife of his brother Shimon. Bito bas Pino du Krove Atzmo. So these are his own biological relatives. And not a relative. These are not arise because of his wife, but because of himself, because we're talking about Anusasa. And he has a principle here that Ein Lecha B'chol Arayos Krovos Li'olim K'vo Yotzei Chalotza. So Bito is first. Now we get to the Krovos of his wife. The Ivy de Tana Shlosha Doros Lamata Dite, Tana Nami Shlosha Doros Lamata Dito. So why is it that Ishto comes second, meaning the daughter of his wife, etc., comes right after Dito? Because it has a very similar structure. It's called Doros Lamata, which means go to Bas Bito, Bas Bino. So you've got 3 generations. And the same thing applies to Ishto. He's got Bas Ishto, Bas Bito, Bas Bino. So we start with his own biological grandchildren, and then we go to his wife's biological grandchildren. And grandchildren is called Doros Lamat, because as we said before, the closest relatives are Yotzei Chalotz. So that gives us Lamat. Aidi the Tana Shlosha Doros Lamata Dida, Tana Shlosha Doros Lamala Dida. So now we go back to his wife, and we go 3 Doros, which is the mother of his wife, that's Hamoso, and her mother, which is called Aim Chamoso, and then we have Aim Chamiv. Next, Vitana Achoso, the Achos Imo, the Krove Atzmo. So it's everything else that was brought here, namely the relatives of his wife, was all because of Doros, whether it be Shalosh Doros Lamata in the case of his wife, or Shalosh Doros Lamala in case of Chamoso, etc. So all that is really ivy. It's all aga. It's not really part of the Seder itself. What really should be plugged in, because we're dealing with Ervas, Krovas, Atzmo, would be Achos. It's there for Tana Achoso, Achos Imo. Again, it was pushed down on the list only because we had to fulfill the ivy, the Krovei Atzmo. So now I think the Gemara is going to ask, okay, you are listing groups in terms of Kirva. Now we're ready to. Why is the Gemara bothered here by? Oh, I got it. Here's the issue. Achoso is his blood relative. Right? So that could be categorized as Krove Atzmo. Achos Imo is also a blood relative. So that's also Krove Atzmo. But what are you going to do with Achos Ishto? Achos Ishto is not Krove Atzmo. In any way biologically related to his sister. So we're going to have to introduce here an ID in order to explain Achos Ishto, because that's pretty consistent. So again, the system is that Eros Atzmo, Krovas Atzmo comes first. So we're really ready now for Achoso and Achos Imo. What about Achos Ishto? Here we have to introduce Ivy. Ivy, the Iri, the Iser Achva Toni Achos Ishto. What's the status of Achos Ishto? It's Iser Ach. Again, it's a little bit strange because it's not at all aligned or similar to the Achva that we've been dealing with. We've been dealing with Achva in our Mishnah as Krove Atzmo. Although it's true that this woman is your wife's sister, but that's not Krovei Atzmo. But the answer is the link is Achva. So you've exhausted all the Achva relationship that is Krovei Atzmo. Now we're going to go into Achva relationship that is Krovei Ishtach. That's the idea. It's so interesting that when we talk about arayos and categorizing them, we can talk about blood relatives as opposed to relatives through marriage. And then we can talk about categories of relationships, even if it's not Krovei Atzmo. It's kind of like a flow chart. You have Krovei Atzmo, and once you have Achva on that list, then Achva splits into two. You could have an Achva that's Krovei Atzmacha, and you can have an Achva that's Krovei Ishtacha. But the Mechayev, so to speak, what the Sivas HaErva, the generating of the Isser, is Achva. It's not your sister, but it's your wife's sister. That's enough in the Gemara's understanding to justify the idea here as to why Achos Ishto was placed right here at this junction, even though we're dealing with Krovei Atzmo. Ubedinu deliktime lekaloso mikame eshes achiv shlo hayabol lomo. Now, eshes achiv shlo hayabol lomo is again a non-biological erva. It's an erva that's based on marriage, on ishus, that this woman was married to your brother. Now, kalaso is a woman who's married to your son. The Gemara now is breaking off from Krovei Atzmo, and we have non-biological arayos. In the cases of Kalaso and Eshes Achiv, but believe it or not, a person is more closely related to his son than to his brother. I mean, I don't know what that means philosophically or psychologically, but in halachic framework, Yotzei Chalotzov are the most intense arayos. So that your son and his wife are closer to being Krovei Atzmo than your wife's sister. Why? Even though your wife's sister is an erva of Achva, but it's through your wife. And in the case of Eshes Achiv Tzalahi Balamo, it's through your brother. Because this is your brother's wife, and there's no mitzvah of Yibum, because Levi did not share any time together with Reuven and so forth and so on. So if we have a choice between Kalaso and Eshes Achiv, Kalaso should come first because it's mi erva, not Atzmo, but miyotzei Chalotzo. Ubitinu delakadme lekalaso. It's like mikame the Eshes Achiv shalhoivel lamo. Kalaso should come first. Dilomishum kurva hu asura. Right? We're not talking about a kirva relation to the Yavam. Ella Ivy the Iri Beiser Achva Tani Eshes Achiv Shalohoya Be'olamo. We had already picked up Achva, like for example Achoso or Achos Imo, and then we expanded it to Achos Ishto. Now we're dealing with achva. So even though kaloso is relationship to his son, which should take more primary preference, but nevertheless, we're dealing with achva, so we're going to choose Eishes Achiv Shlo Hoya Ba'olamo, and the Hadar Tani Kaloso, because again, Kaloso is a relationship of Ishus, but not of Ishus of Achva, so it doesn't belong in that category. It's left in the last category of Ishus of Goodman. Okay, and this gives us the ability to make a siyum on this very long, complicated sugya here of the sequence in our mission. So tomorrow, Mitzvah Hashem, we'll begin with my Iridutani Potros Oroseyan, and that's going to be the Mitzvah Hashem for tomorrow. Make a note of where we got up to.